Welcome back to today's video. In today's video, we're going to be looking at Biden's easiest path to 270 for the 2024 election, taking a look at the polling data, the swing states, the aggregation, and taking a look at all of that. Let's go right into today's video. Alright, welcome back to today's video. In today's video, we're going to be looking at a head-to-head Biden versus Trump election, specifically talking about how Biden can win the 2024 election. So taking a look at this here at some presidential general election polls, and we're going to go through this relatively quickly just because I want to focus on some other information. But in these general election polls here, we see that Trump is leading in the majority of the polls by around 4 to 8 points in a majority of the polls. 4 to 5 points, sorry. This poll right over here is a Trump versus Harris poll. Now, when we look at this 4 years ago, Biden was leading by 8.4%, whereas now it's almost the complete reverse here. We see that Trump's leading by around 4 to 5 points. Biden was leading by around 8 points 4 years ago. Now let's take a look here at some of the closest states in the 2020 election. So the closest states in the 2020 election here, taking a look at this in the state of Arizona, this was one of the closest states. Biden led Trump by 0.3% of the vote when all the votes had been counted. Although in the polling data in the lead up to the election, we saw actually that it was a little bit different. Biden was leading in most of the polls by 2.6%, whereas in the actual election, he ended up leading by 0.3%. That's a margin of error for that particular poll there in the state of Arizona by around 2.3%. So when we take that 2.3% aggregation into account here, we can see here that Trump actually is overperforming by around 4 to 3 points here, by around 5 points in some polls even. When we have a six-way race, three-way race, we see here that Trump actually performs a lot better when you factor in more of the candidates. Although even in head-to-head matchups, Trump also ends up leading as well. In some polls, Trump is even hitting the 50% mark, although in a majority of the polls, he is going below that. But taking a look at this, that was for the state of Arizona. Now going on to the state of Georgia. For the state of Georgia here, Trump is also leading by around around 5 to 8 points in a majority of the polls. We will ignore this poll just for the purpose of the fact that this poll includes a Haley versus Biden matchup, and we will ignore this poll which shows Biden ahead because of the DeSantis versus Biden matchup. So we shall ignore that poll. But taking a look at this 4 years ago, Biden was leading in the polls by around 1.2%. In the actual election, he ended up leading by around 0.3% around that margin there. So the poll had a margin of error of 0.8% around that margin. Now, when we take a look here at current polling here, it's it's not looking too good whatsoever for Biden. If the margin of polling data was 0.6% in favor of Trump, then you could add 0.8% to every single one of these polls that Trump is ahead in. Okay, so that's not necessarily so good for Biden. Moving on here to the state of Wisconsin, we see here that Trump is leading barely ahead of Biden. Now, he's leading, although Biden is leading in some of these polls. We shall ignore this poll, which is a Haley versus Biden matchup. Although in this poll, Trump is even with Biden. Trump's ahead by 3 points, 5 points, 8 points, 4 points, and 6 points, respectively. We see here that Biden is ahead by 4 points and 5 points in these two polls, and Trump is ahead by 2 points and 1 point. Although taking a look at this here, going back to the 2020 election, we saw that Biden was actually around 8.4% ahead of then President Trump. Although when you look at the actual election, we saw that Biden actually ended up winning by only around 0.6%. That is a huge margin of error for that poll going back to the 2020 election. And again, the reason why I'm showing you all this data is that way you guys can have a general idea of how accurate these polls are, how accurate the polling data was versus the actual election, and what that can tell for current polling data, which shows Trump leading in a majority of these polls. Moving on here to the state of Pennsylvania, here we see that President Biden is actually leading President Trump. Now, this is very interesting considering the fact that Michigan is considered a much more liberal state compared to Pennsylvania. Although that being said, Pennsylvania is showing signs for a possible Biden victory here in the state of Pennsylvania, a likely or a lean or some type of likely margin for President Biden winning here in the state of Pennsylvania. Going back 4 years ago, we saw here that Biden in the lead up to the election was leading by 4.7%. In the actual election, he ended up leading by only 1.2%. So that'll just show you how accurate the polling data is. In the state of Michigan here, we see that Trump is also ahead by pretty relatively large margins, 5 points, 6 points, 5 points, 12 points, 8 points, 3 points, and 2 points. Biden actually leads Trump in one of these polls in a head-to-head matchup. Biden is ahead by 4 points. In the five-way race, we see here that Trump's ahead by 6 points. In another five-way race, Trump is ahead by 12 points. And in this other five-way race, we see here that Trump is ahead by 2 points. Going back here 4 years ago, we saw here that the polling data in the lead up to the election showed President Biden, that then former Vice President Biden, ahead by 7.9%. Although taking a look at what we have right now, we see here in the state of Michigan, we saw that in the actual election, Biden led by around 2.8% compared to the polling data showing him leading by larger margins than was actually he actually performed. He performed less than what the margins actually showed. In the state of Virginia, here taking a look at current polling data, here we see that President Biden continues his lead in this state of Virginia. Not surprisingly, really, the fact of the matter is that Biden won the state by a relatively large margin in the 2020 election. In fact, President Biden actually overperformed polling expectations in the 2020 election. He ended up winning 10% more of the vote compared to then President Trump. Taking a look at this here, what the polling data was telling us here in the state of Virginia, it showed President Biden leading by around, then former Vice President Biden, rather, leading by around 11.8%. He ended up winning by around 10.1%. I'm not really going to argue with regards to the validity of the polling data. And now we see here that President Biden is continuing his lead. In the state of Minnesota, Biden is currently leading by around 3 to 4 points. Going back to the 2020 election, Biden, I believe I opened up the same, sorry, that was the same two tabs, but let me just go ahead and show you this poll here. I didn't have it ready. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the polling data. Going back 4 years ago in the 2020 election, we saw that Biden was leading by around 9 points in the lead up to the election. He ended up winning by a relatively large margin. He ended up winning by around 7 points or so in the actual election. So that is quite a large margin. Yeah, and the polling data continues to show President Biden in the lead. In the state of North Carolina, here we see here that Trump is also continuing his lead. He's led by 10 points, 13 points, 4 points, 9 points, 11 points, and then 9 points and 9 points and 9 points. We see here also in some 4-way, 3-way, and 5-way matchups, Trump is continuing his lead. 4 years ago, Biden was actually leading in the polls by around 1.8%, although when the actual election came, we saw here that President Trump actually ended up winning. Then President Trump ended up winning by around 1.4%. All right, so that is all the data that you need to be aware of. That is a lot of data. I know that was a lot of data to go through very quickly, but that is kind of a general outlook into where the polls are showing former President Trump and current President Biden and how accurate the polls were in the lead up to the 2020 election. And that being said, the 2020 election was obviously a very different election compared to the 2024 election, in that we obviously had issues such as COVID, we had issues such as the economy, obviously issues such as race relations was a much more bigger issue for voters compared to issues like the economy. So you had COVID, obviously. We can't obviously infer too much from previous polling data errors. Obviously, excitement within both the Biden and Trump camps was obviously a motivating factor. And that being said, a lot of people are saying the Democrats are leaving President Biden. Now, I do tend to agree and disagree at the same time with that notion. When you go ahead and look at the recent primary that just took place, recent primary, Biden wasn't actually in the primary. He was a write-in candidate. Although that being said, Biden did end up winning in the state of New Hampshire. We saw there that the DNC, the Democratic Party, was unifying itself around President Biden. Now, that is contrary to how many individuals have been putting it recently, that President Biden is way behind with regards to the Democratic base and excitement within the Democratic base. Now, that being said, I accept that argument to a certain extent due to the fact that you do see that in a lot of polls, the Hispanic population and particularly the Hispanic population. Now, I know the black community has been going a little bit away from Joe Biden, although the margins are not too great, and I would like to wait until election day to actually see how these margins are actually playing out. Currently, Biden is losing about 5% of black people, who voted for President Biden, at least in the polls, who were polled to like President Biden, are now supporting the former president. So when you go up to the 2020 election, you saw that Trump was getting about 8% of the black vote. Now he's polling at around 13%. Okay, 13%. So about a 5% increase. 5% is a lot. Okay, black people account for about 13% of the population. And generally speaking, black turnout is relatively low. So compared to other ethnic groups. So when you put that in, 5% of 13% is about 0.5% or so. No, sorry, 5% of 13% is actually extremely low. It's about 0.5% around that margin. But 0.5% could change a lot in an election, especially in swing states like Arizona and Georgia. 0.5% can play a lot. Also, in the Hispanic population, Biden seems to be losing a lot in this with regards to this certain ethnic group. In a lot of the polls that are coming out, you're seeing that Biden's leading Trump by only around maybe 10 to 15 points among about maybe sometimes even 3 points among the Hispanic population. So that is concerning news for the Biden camp and relatively good news for the Trump camp. But that is with regards to how all this is playing out. Now, obviously, we have the first official primary, I would say, in the state of South Carolina, due to the fact that Biden was not actually in the primary in the state of New Hampshire. He was just a write-in candidate. But we're seeing that primary. I already put out a prediction for for the South Carolina primary. I predicted that Biden would win around 70% of the vote, and that his competitors would win 10% or less of the vote. So that is some backdrop there. Now let's take a look here at the individual states, Biden's easiest path. Now, I didn't include Nevada in the swing states, and I have looked at polling data in the state of Nevada, and I can say that the former president is in the lead. Moving on here in the state of uh, Minnesota, Biden is currently in the lead. He did win the state by around 7 points in the 2020 election. I do think that he's going to win the state again. Moving on here to the state of North Carolina, Trump does seem to be in the lead, and he does seem to be overperforming polls by a relatively good margin. Even in the 2020 election, he overperformed the polling data. Now he seems to be ahead by relatively large margins. Moving on here, let's take a look here at the state of Wisconsin. The state of Wisconsin, we do see here that it is much closer than most of the states, so I will be giving this to President Biden there. President Biden will win that state by a tilt margin. Now, I don't necessarily think that President Biden is actually going to win in the state of Wisconsin. I don't think that he's going to win in the state of Wisconsin. I think he's going to lose in the state of Wisconsin. Although that being said, you have to consider several things. Number one, you have to consider the fact that this video is Biden's easiest path to 270. So I have already actually calculated how President Biden can win the 2020 election and Biden's kind of easiest path to 270. And that would take place with several states like Minnesota, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Nebraska's second congressional district. Those types of states are going to be Biden's easiest path to 270, not necessarily the likely path. It is the likely path. If Biden were to win to 270, this would probably be the map. Okay, if Biden were to win the 2020 election, this would most likely be the map. Although, do I consider that this map as being likely? No. I consider that President Trump is actually leading in a majority of these polls. He's actually gaining support compared to where he was 4 years ago. And even in the 2020 election, he lost by an extremely small margin. The fact that he's leading in a majority of the polls show that he's in a very good position right now to win the 2024 election. So moving on here, let's go ahead and take a look here at the state of Michigan. In the state of Michigan here, according to polling data, Trump does seem to be leading by relatively large margins. Even in one poll, he's ahead by 12 points, which is unprecedented for Trump to lead in a poll in the state of Michigan by that big of a margin. But there you go, in the state of Michigan, we'll go tilt for the former president. Moving on here, President Biden here. Sorry, let me get rid of that there for a second. I was actually thinking about something else, but we'll leave that there off for now. But moving on here, the state of Arizona, Trump will win the state of Arizona. He is in the lead in a majority of these polls here. He's ahead by relatively large margins. Obviously, have issues like the border crisis at the southern border, stuff like that. Obviously, deflecting from Biden's popularity. In the state of Georgia, also Trump's leading. So in the state of Georgia, Trump is leading relatively large margins there, around 5 to 8 points in the state of Georgia. Moving on here to the state of Virginia, Biden's leading in a majority of the polls. He won by around 11%. He will win in the state by a tilt margin. Moving on here to the state of Pennsylvania, Biden is leading in the polls, which is relatively good news for him because Pennsylvania currently is the only swing state, according to 538, that Biden is leading in, other than Virginia and Minnesota. Pennsylvania is the really only state in the Rust Belt other than Virginia and Minnesota. So that is for the state of Pennsylvania. Moving on here, the state of Michigan will vote for President Biden. Now, I know that I just pointed out to a poll which shows him ahead. Now, that being said, which shows Trump rather ahead, you have to consider the likely path, the easiest path, the easiest path to 270. Is Biden more likely to win Arizona or Michigan? Or is he more likely to win Georgia or Michigan? I'm going to say he's more likely to win Arizona or Georgia. Trump's most likely to win Arizona or Georgia. Even in Nevada or Michigan, which is more likely for President Biden? I'm going to go ahead and say Michigan. Again, this is Biden's easiest path to 270. Do I think that Biden's going to win in the state of Michigan? No. He's behind in the polls in the state of Michigan. So I don't think he's going to win. Even the state of Wisconsin, do I think that Biden's going to win? No. In the state of Pennsylvania, do I think Biden's going to win? Possibly. Yes, he's ahead by a very small margin, 0.3%. He's within the margin of error when you go back to the 2020 election. When you look at the state of Pennsylvania, Biden was leading by around 4.7%, although in the actual election, he ended up winning by around 1.2%. So he is within his margin of error of the 2020 election. All that being said, this is Biden's easiest path. This is not the likely path. This is the easiest path. Okay, this is the easiest path to get to that bare minimum threshold. And obviously, I didn't want to give Biden the state of Nevada compared to Michigan, because Nevada isn't going to make him cross 270. So obviously, a lot of factors that I considered into this. I don't think Biden's going to win in Michigan. I don't think he's going to win in Wisconsin. I think that he has a chance in the state of Pennsylvania, although that chance does seem to be diminishing due to the fact that it is within the margin of error for the polling data in the 2020 election. All right, so that is for the state of Pennsylvania. Moving on here, let's go ahead and give Nebraska's 2nd congressional district to President Biden. And we're going to go ahead and give Maine's 2nd congressional district to former President Trump. So there you go. We have 0 toss-up states, 0 districts left. And with that being said, we have here President Biden at 270 electoral votes, that bare minimum threshold to be having a re-election campaign, and Donald Trump at 268 electoral votes. If you like this video, please hit the subscribe button down below and like the video. It really helps out if you're able to subscribe, and every subscriber definitely helps out. And obviously, the South Carolina primary is happening on Saturday, February 3rd, 2024. So I will try to release this video before the primary begins. But I have already released my prediction for the primary. I believe that President Biden will be winning by around, he'll probably get around 70% of the vote. Dean Phillips, I mean, the guy basically has similar policies like President Biden, although he hasn't been registering that much support among individuals in these particular swing states and among Democrats in general. Also, he hasn't been getting much media attention either. Media attention has for Dean Phillips has been going very down. Also, Marianne Williamson, she got around 4% of the vote in the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire tends to be more liberal compared to South Carolina. South Carolina is much more moderate in terms of the Democrats, and I don't think Marianne Williamson is going to be getting any large amount of votes in the state of South Carolina compared to New Hampshire. So several things at play there. Anyways, this is my final prediction for Biden's easiest path to 270. Not the likely path. Once again, I do want to specify that, not the likely path, but the easiest path to 270. And I shall see you in the next video.